I'm the new secretary, and I get to introduce Jessica Dahl, our presenter today. And some of you may have been here last year when she spoke to us about some landscaping for rewilding. So she's back again today to talk about how we can landscape to encourage pollinators. Jessica first gave today's talk at the Whitby Gardening Conference in 2022 as part of a pollinator session with Sue Gotez and Toby Nelson. Today's talk is an expanded version with more detailed information included especially for the Lopez Island Garden Club. Now next month, Thor Hansen will be back, and this time it will be in person. And Thor will delve into garden pollinators in general. So today we will obtain ideas around how we can landscape to support pollinators. And next month we will learn a lot of specific information about the actual pollinators from a field biologist perspective. So we're trying to kind of tie some of these programs together. Jessica has a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design. I think this is super cool. While she was there, she saw a poster advertising a sustainable building internship program for a nonprofit in the Pacific Northwest, which was the Lopez Community Land Trust. So Jessica came to Lopez to participate in their internship for 3 summers while she was in grad school. And she must have fallen in love. So after completing her degree, she worked for the Seattle Urban Farm Company for 4 years, where she developed and ran the design department, designing edible gardens and urban farms for public spaces, schools, restaurants, and residences. And she also regularly dug into the soil while farming across the city. In 2016, she founded Field and Grove Design Studio in Lopez. Field and Grove specializes in sustainable site planning, native and habitat enriching planting plans, and edible garden design. So kindly hold any questions you have until the end, and let's give Jessica a warm welcome.
Good morning. So nice to be back, and I'm really excited to kick off this season. And also with this talk about pollinators, it was really fun doing the research for this last year, and all I needed was an excuse to read more books on pollinator design and pollinators themselves. I'm so excited that Thor will be here next month to talk about the pollinators themselves, because that's something that's been a big learning curve for me, and I'm excited to learn more from him. This is a great pairing, so thank you to the Garden Club for setting that up. Today, we'll be talking about pollinators and garden design. Pollinators play a crucial role in our ecosystems, yet many are facing population decline from pressures of pesticides and habitat loss. The good news is that even a small pollinator garden with the correct elements can make a big difference. Today, we'll be talking about how to build a framework for attracting a range of pollinators to your landscape through key strategies for designing habitats. Pollinators need food, water, and shelter throughout the seasons and throughout their life cycles. Native plants are often their preferred choice for both food and shelter. We'll be looking at 4 specific and often overlooked native plants that play a key role in supporting native pollinator species in all seasons. So let's kick it off. Why pollinators matter. If you watch any film or read any book about pollinators, these are the statistics you will hear over and over again. They are really, no one's arguing with these stats anymore. 1/3 of our food is the direct result of animal pollinators. 3/4 of all flowering plants require animal pollinators to successfully reproduce, and many seed crops and native plants also require animal pollinators to reproduce. And in terms, just to briefly touch on what hopefully Thor will talk lots more about, to define pollinators, pollinators are not just bees, but bees, flies, wasps, butterflies, moths, beetles, hummingbirds, and even bats are capable of pollination. And why are pollinators in decline? Most researchers agree that a combination of factors is what is causing declines in bee and pollinator populations. These include the spread of parasites and diseases among pollinator populations. That's what first caused a big pollinator decline several decades ago in the US with a mite that came over from Europe. Also loss of habitat and specific flowers that provide pollen and nectar, as well as pesticide exposure. And all of these are compounded by climate change. But in good news, even a small pollinator garden has been proven to make a difference. Studies show that there's a significant increase in both abundance, the overall quantity of pollinators, and diversity, the number of species of native bees present in just a 30-square-foot pollinator garden. So think about making a garden that is the size of a large dining room table, like your Thanksgiving table. If you can put in pollinator space that's the equivalent of a big Thanksgiving spread in your dining room, that will make a difference, which is pretty awesome and empowering. And these really high numbers for abundance and diversity stay high through 300 square feet, which is the size of this garden in the picture, which is not very large. And that's even omitting the space for the stepping stones. So this is just to say that it is very possible to create a garden, a pollinator garden that's going to make a difference. And these studies that I'm referencing are specifically for this slide from Michigan State. And I'll have a bunch of references at the end if anyone wants to read some of these studies. They're actually pretty cool. So there are 3 elements that are critical to designing pollinator habitat, and that's that you need to provide pollinators with food, water, and shelter. And then it's important, as I mentioned at the beginning, to provide those elements both throughout the seasons, because some pollinators will live more than a year, and then also specifically through their life cycles, because some pollinators, like flies, will be cycling through their whole life cycle in just a few days, or only in their adult phase for a few days. So there are these different time frames that you're looking at throughout using those elements. For food, we're talking about both nectar and pollen for adults, along with forage for the larvae state. Host plants play a critical role, especially for some butterfly species that only have a single host plant, such as the monarch butterfly, which only uses milkweed. Nectar provides carbohydrates, while pollen is a source of protein, fat, vitamins, and minerals. You want to provide these flowering plants throughout the seasons to feed the pollinators for as long as possible. Water is not just for hydration, but actually is also used for food and building materials. Butterflies consume minerals from mud puddles, while other pollinators such as bees, wasps, and birds use mud as a building material. So you want to try to provide water and mud wherever pollinators are present in your garden, as challenging as that can be if you like a tidy garden, but the mud is very important. So you can purposely leave some little depressions in your soil. Then for shelter, pollinators seek out nesting materials as well as protective habitats, such as host plants, hollow-stemmed plants, decaying wood, snakes, brush piles, leaves, grasses, bare soil, and rock piles. You can also provide roosting boxes, bat houses, butterfly houses, insect hotels. There are lots of ways to get creative. Each pollinator has a specific requirement for shelter, and all have vulnerable developmental stages such as pupation or overwintering. I like to try to remind myself to provide both rest, their overwintering habitat, and nest or their nesting habitat to ensure that they have the different habitats that they need for different parts of their life cycles. And this is a lot of what I'll be referencing today comes from some great studies out of Oregon State University. And this slide shows a leafcutter bee that's cutting discs from petals of a Clarkia flower. And it's both just stunning to see what the bee is doing, and in the bottom left, how precise of a circle it's cut out. And then also just the sheer beauty of the nest that it's making in the last photo on the right. This is in a sunflower stalk, and it's rolling petals into the stalk to form cells, and each cell contains a provision of pollen and a single egg. Just really, really stunning. So in addition to those key elements, I've outlined 10 design principles that'll help you think about how to design pollinator landscapes. And these 10 concepts will range from the big picture concepts for where do you want to site your pollinator garden, and then a lot of specific planting ideas. So let's dive into those. First one is to connect existing wildlife and pollinator corridors. Roadsides often provide the only connection between patches of remnant habitat. You look on Lopez at all of our hedgerows that are intact if the county doesn't cut them too far back. You've got Nootka rose and sometimes Oregon grape and snowberry and hawthorn and all these great native species for pollinators that are just right there along the roadside. So a great place to start if you have a hedgerow along your property or a natural area is to build upon that. Another great idea is to look at, if you have neighbors close by, look at what they have going on in their property. Do they have a garden with pollinator habitat that you could build upon to kind of link to theirs? The picture on the right is a leftover space after we had this little kind of triangle between the shed and the main garden that is fenced in on the left-hand side of the slide. We had this kind of awkward triangle left over, and we were trying to figure out what to do with it. And so we actually just got to take down the fencing on this summer. We planted it out with mainly a lot of Nootka rose and then diversified with a few other pollinator species. And it creates this great linkage between the garden that the more manicured and designed garden, and continuing out to the edge of their property, which has a lot more wild and native species in it. And so it was a great way to just fill that corridor, so to speak. Second principle is to include wild and undisturbed areas, especially for nest sites. Most bees nest in ground tunnels. 70% of bees nest in the ground. That just continues to wow me. I think we conceptualize bees being in nests that we can see. Even just yesterday, I came across what I believe was an old vole hole that bees had taken over to become their nest. The rest of bees tend to nest in hollow plant stems or decaying wood. So you want to be sure to provide some bare soil that drains well. That means no mulch, no landscape fabric, which can be tricky, but find a spot in your landscape. And then you also want to think about leaving, especially from a maintenance perspective, leaving hollow stems and dead wood for above ground nesting. A great maintenance tip is to, instead of deadheading all the way to the ground, at a minimum to leave stems at 6 inches tall or longer if you can bear to do it. But that will give pollinators a chance to use that for habitat. And in these two pictures, the picture on the left is actually a garden I designed in Mexico, but you can see between the sage bushes in the foreground, there's just some bare soil there. And I don't think it detracts from the garden design. I think the rest of it is still has grown in quite nicely, but the pollinators specifically right around those sage bushes that they just love creates space for nesting, so they can have their nest site right where their feeding and foraging area is. And then on the right, this is a newer garden here on Lopez up near the ferry. And we've put in, you can see the edible garden with the raised beds is enclosed, and then the slope to the left is kind of a mixture of meadowscape with pollinator flowers. But there are patches throughout this space under the fir trees and next to this kind of dry swale that we've created, dry stream bed. There are patches of bare soil, so the pollinators are able to nest in this area. And again, obviously this one on the right is brand new, so it'll grow in a lot more. But the idea is the same, that bare patches don't have to detract from your garden space, especially if they're serving such an important purpose. Next concept is to replace lawns with native grasses and wildflowers. And this is something that's really popular right now, but it doesn't, I think when people hear that, they think, oh, I have to have this really tall meadow or let my lawn grow up. And that's not at all the case. This is a great mix by ProTime Seeds out of Portland that's called Fleur de Lawn. And they used to sell it at Sunset. I'm not sure if they still do, but it's wonderful. It only, it doesn't grow more than a foot tall. It contains all these wonderful flowers that you see are just spilling out over the rocks. And we used it for this whole swath of the side of a property that otherwise was just going to be lawn. And I think it's so much more beautiful. The pollinators just love it. It's grown in really, really well. So ProTime is a great source. And then another great company for sourcing wildflowers is Northwest Meadowscapes out of Port Townsend and Whitby. And those are my two favorite seed sources. You can also add flowering plants to existing short lawns, such as early season bulbs. Even if you're not willing to forego the lawn, you could plant early season bulbs before the lawn starts growing and then mow them down once the lawn starts growing. You can add in clover. Micro clover is a great thing to add into lawns. Thyme is wonderful as well. So you can start thinking about either replacing lawns or slowly adapting them by introducing other small plants. Continuing to use the right plant, right place theory works really well for pollinators as well. The main thing that does is by having plants that are happy, you can avoid pesticide use and you can avoid extended bloom times because the plants simply aren't, or that'll lead to extended bloom times because the plants aren't stressed. So they're not attracting pests that would call for pesticides, and they're happy to bloom longer because they're in the right place. So two examples of that, we've got cilantro that's gone to seed in an edible garden. So obviously you're going to plant your edible garden in the sun, but thinking about allowing some of your edible garden to go to seed, either actually just collected this seed. So it was dual purpose, both to feed the pollinators and to collect seed. But I'd really encourage you to let some of your edible garden go to seed. And then choosing plants where you do have shadier areas, like this anemone on the right-hand side does really well in part shade locations. I even have it in some pretty deep shade locations where it blooms just wonderfully. And it's a great kind of later flower in the garden, and it comes up so tall that even, especially as a late flower, to have a tall late flower that comes up above other things the pollinators can find it is really wonderful. You can also keep plants blooming longer by deadheading flowers before they start to seed and administering low levels of irrigation, even for drought tolerant plants. If you give them just a little bit of water, they'll keep blooming. The next design principle is to plant in drifts, which is the concept of planting fewer, larger blocks of plants. Using a minimum of 3 plants of a species together, this makes foraging really easy, especially because certain pollinators will only forage from a particular species, or even if they are a generalist that likes to go out and forage for different species, typically even the generalist will choose one plant kind of for the day or the time period. And so by giving them more than one plant to go to of the same species, they're able to keep working for a longer period of time and use less energy flying back and forth further distances. Native bees in particular are attracted to larger blocks of flowers compared to smaller disconnected clumps. And the benefits of larger patches can be particularly pronounced for smaller bees, which generally have smaller foraging ranges, typically about 150 to 300 feet from their nest. So again, if you can provide a space for the nest near the flowers and then start doing clumps or drifts of flowers together. So here on the left, we've got a clump of grasses and then a clump of sage and the beginning of a clump of echinacea that's growing in, and then some agastache in the background, but all of them are at minimum 3 plants. I think they're actually all 5s in this garden. And so the pollinators literally showed up the day we planted this garden. It was really incredible. Maybe the sculpture helped. They were already attracted to the colors of the wind sculpture. But and then the garden on the right is kind of an illustration of larger swaths. And in the background, there's a very large swath of columbine that we've let go to seed. So it was planted in a smaller clump and it's slowly starting to take over the landscape. Kinnikinnick is the ground cover in the foreground, and that's a really great early season native pollinator. Then we've got manzanita and salal are the next step up, more great native pollinators. And in the background, we've got Oregon grape and evergreen huckleberry. So this is, in terms of the evergreens and the columbine, that's all natives. The only exception is the bloodgrass for color along the path. And then the ferns aren't pollinators, of course, but the rest of the garden are all, those plants were probably at a minimum planted probably a dozen per species. Next principle is to create a continuous bloom period. Here's a garden in both summer and then late fall. And we've still got not only the bloom period continuing with the Rudbeckia, but the yarrow has been left and we leave it to overwinter so that those stems can be used. And preferably you would always have, if you have a large enough space, you'd have several species blooming at each time. So you'd have a handful for spring and summer and fall, so that when each one, just because it's so hard to time the overlaps just perfectly. So if you only have one spring pollinator flower and one for summer and one for fall, you're probably going to have a gap. But if you do a minimum of 3 for each season, then you have a pretty good chance of having them overlap. And I have a great guide from Oregon State University that's at the table outside that you can pick up on your way out, called Native Plants for Pollinators West of the Cascades. And it's got a wonderful guide that shows the timing of flowering for plants. So be sure to pick that up. And there is a link on here as well that goes to some of their studies that I'll be including today. The next design principle is to provide varied flowers and diverse plant families. So that means for varied flowers, you want various colors, shapes, sizes, such as the tiny thyme we have on the left, and then the larger apple flower on the right. That's also illustrating utilizing diverse plant families, everything from ground covers, annual flowers, perennial flowers, shrubs, trees, vines, really thinking in as many planes, if you will, and scales of plants, so that the pollinators, as they're flying around, they can find different plants. And then also each pollinator has different needs. Bees like yellow and purple or blue and generally shallow flowers. Butterflies need clusters of short tubular flowers with a wide landing pad. Hummingbirds prefer red and large tubular flowers. So by having some diversity or figuring out what your favorite pollinators are and specifically planting what they like, you can attract either a really good diversity with diverse colors and shapes, or aim for some really specific pollinators if that's something you'd like to do. Ensuring high plant diversity means serving the widest number of pollinator species. And so you really want to think beyond perennial flowers to these other plant families to be able to maximize pollinator resources. You also want to focus on single flowers that produce pollen and nectar and avoid hybridized varieties that often actually lack pollen and nectar nutrition. And that's something that takes a little bit of research, but if you either have your smartphone out while you're shopping at a nursery or do some research ahead of time, there are lots of great resources that list open pollinated varieties, or doing the reverse, looking at what the sterile varieties are so that you can avoid them. But doing research is really important, especially with perennial flowers. You also want to avoid double flowers because their extra flower petals can often block pollen and make the nectaries inaccessible. So like those big, gorgeous peonies that are just stuffed with petals aren't going to do much for the pollinators, even though they're really beautiful. Also, be sure to grow host plants. It's such a critical habitat for food, especially for butterflies, but for all the pollinators. Thinking about where their eggs and larvae and chrysalis are all going to take shape. I really like to think about trees as host plants. This is the cornelian cherry on the right that I really love planting, and Stephen grows them here on Lopez. And I've got a lot of babies out in different gardens around Lopez, and I'm enjoying watching them grow up, but they're a great butterfly host plant. On the left, we have native mock orange, which is really wonderful. I swear every time I go to the garden where I took this photo, there is always a butterfly on this plant. And I didn't have enough space to plant the 3 of them as suggested, but this is the 300 square foot garden from the very beginning of the program. So there's just one, but literally every time I go there, when it's in bloom, there's at least one butterfly. It's really incredible. Then our last design concept is to incorporate native plants. We've got Oregon grape on the left and Douglas aster on the right. And now we'll take a bit of a deep dive into native plants for pollinators. Why use native plants? Over 90% of native insects cannot complete their life cycles without native plants. That is such an astounding number to me to think about what would happen without native plants to our pollinators. It's frightening, but yeah, just pretty awesome what our native plants are doing in terms of supporting the pollinators. Native plants are also 4 times more alluring to native bees than exotic flowers. And it's kind of a no-brainer, but native plants are adapted to provide the best habitat for native pollinators. They've grown up together, so to speak, and they're working together to adapt to our climate and together. And adapting over time. Often, if you are going to have one pollinator habitat goal, I would suggest trying to attract the broadest range of pollinators, and that's exactly what native plants do. And so if you're able to incorporate more native plants into your landscape, and it doesn't need to be 100%, but just heavy on the native plants, you'll improve the odds of attracting the broadest range of insect pollinators. And I'll show this slide a little larger later, but this is one of the studies from Oregon State that goes along with the flyer. This is from the OSU Garden Ecology Lab. And they spent 3 years studying in the Willamette Valley, studying native plants and pollination. They compared approximately a dozen control ornamental pollination flowers, such as lavender, to 3 dozen native pollinator flowers, both annuals and perennials. And then published in their report, they published the top 10 native plants in terms of their performance, both for overall attraction of pollinators, but looking both at the species richness, and then also their ability to attract a diversity of native pollinator species. And so that's what this chart is showing, that in the 3-year study, lavender in the course of 3 years, only attracted 8 unique pollinator species, whereas the star of the show, the Douglas aster, in 3 years attracted 74 unique pollinator species, which just blows the lavender out of the water. Pretty incredible. So if there's one plant you're going to plant, I'll talk more about it, but it's the Douglas aster. So let's look at each season and think about how to incorporate native plants into the garden for pollinators. Late winter flowering can be challenging, but we have a lot of great options here in the Pacific Northwest. So we're really looking at when pollinators are first starting to emerge. Often the first thing I see is a bumblebee, the bombus family, in February and March. And my favorite early blooming native is Oregon grape. I've listed as many as I could think of for things that I think are really reliable. And for each season, I've tried to list anything I can from trees to shrubs to perennials, annuals, and ground covers, so that, again, you can have that diversity of plant families to really support a broad range of pollinators. So Oregon grape, I'm sure you all know, but it's an evergreen shrub. And it blooms sometime February through May. Varies. Each one of these will vary by year and what our climate and weather are currently doing. The clusters of the yellow flowers are so incredibly fragrant. If you've never smelled it, please do next spring. It's just incredible. In gardens where I have a large enough swath now, to leave a good amount for the pollinators, I do use it as a cut flower because it is just so incredible. And if you cut the leaves off of it, people who aren't gardeners will be stunned by it and have absolutely no clue what it is, even if they would be able to tell you what pokey Oregon grape is outside. You cut those leaves off and they'll just be blown away. It's a fun party trick, if you will, or hostess gift. And the Oregon grape, in addition to the bumblebees that I always see on them, they also attract a variety of different bees, painted lady butterflies, and hummingbirds. Spring, we're starting to get a little bit more of a plant list going. You'll see a lot more perennials starting to pop up. And for spring, I wanted to look to a tree in the western redbud, which is a deciduous tree. It comes out with a red, really, I would probably call it the pink bud. Comes out before the leaves, and the leaves are this wonderful heart shape that's really fun to have in the garden. And gosh, the list of bees in particular that love this tree. We have native long-tongued bees, honeybees, bumblebees, mason bees, cuckoo bees, longhorn bees, mining bees, and sweat bees. And each one of those has multiple species that love it. So it is an amazing powerhouse of a tree for spring pollination. And it also is a host plant for the larvae of several butterflies and moths. One caveat that I will mention is that the western redbud, as Stephen knows, is very hard to grow and hard to find. So if you do ever find it at a native plant sale, be sure to grab some. Let me know about it. So I do plant a lot of the eastern redbud as well, and that's the majority of what I'm planting right now. And it is also a great pollinator. It's still a North American native, so it's still able to do a lot of the work for a lot of the same pollinators. It's just not as extensive of a list as the western redbud, and not as specific to our region, but you're still going to have a lot of pollinators coming to an eastern redbud as well. Here's where the list gets really big. Summer flowering, July through September, and you'll start seeing some overlap if you were to go through this list in detail, and we'll distribute it digitally so that you have a copy of it. You'll start seeing the overlap between spring and summer and fall, but for the sake of still being able to read a little bit of it, I left it, didn't repeat things across, even if a lot of these do go across multiple seasons. For spring, or for summer, I wanted to talk about a little unusual plant in terms of pollinators, which is an ornamental grass. The tufted hairgrass is a perennial grass. It grows really well here on Lopez. I've planted a lot of it in private gardens, as well as we have a big swath of it at Housing Lopez that is just going gangbusters and looking amazing. It blooms with its beige inflorescence from June to September, sometimes a little longer. And it's a really important host plant for the Juba skipper butterfly. And even though it's specific to one butterfly, it's a great example of thinking outside the box to grasses as a host for pollinators, because I think it's very rare that is ever discussed. And I use a lot of grasses in my design work. And so I was really delighted when I first discovered a few years ago that they're actually providing, they're acting as a great host plant for butterfly species in particular. So there are a lot of great ornamental grasses that you can look at. This is a great native one to use that grows really, really well here. And it establishes really quickly too. Then finally for fall, so then we get into fall, October, November, and your real goal for fall, just like we had in the spring, like trying to get those early flowers so that you can be ready for the pollinators as soon as they emerge. Then on the other end of the spectrum and seasons, trying to stretch out those blooms as long as you can, especially if we have a really dry fall like we did last year, or warm fall, then the pollinators are out longer. And so trying to stretch your blooms out as long as possible into the end of the fall is really helpful for them. Here's where we'll look a little bit more at the Douglas aster, which is an herbaceous perennial flower. It can sometimes bloom as long as July through November. And last year was a year where until we got our cold snap in November, it was still blooming. It was just incredible, just months and months. And it has that really classic garden appeal of the purple flower with the yellow center, which the bees just love. And it's their perfect combo of purple and yellow. And it attracts just a huge diversity of bee and butterfly species, as we saw in this study here. It is a little bit bigger, attracting 74 unique species over the course of the 3 summers that they were counting. It also attracts and works as a host plant for various butterflies as well. So it's just, like I said, if there's one flower that you're going to add into your garden after this talk, I'd encourage it to be the Douglas aster, because it'll bring the most pollinators to your garden. But there are lots of other incredible native flower options as well. So these are the other 10 that came out of the OSU study. So you can see the variety there of colors, of perennials and annuals. They're just lots of great options. And so I think we may have even sent the handout after my last talk with the native plants, but with these 4 different seasons. So we'll send it out again so everyone has it, so you don't have to read all these lists. But the big goal being get something in there that flowers as early as possible in February, March, and then start really rounding out to a robust garden in spring and fall, stretching it out as spring and summer, and then stretch it out as far as possible into the fall. Finally, I just wanted to list these references, and these are also on the handout that we'll forward digitally. These are my favorite sources, and they're just, if you're as fascinated by pollinators as I am, but really want to read about it from a plant perspective, these are fantastic resources. The first one is the study that shows the native plant picks for bees, this one here, put out by Oregon State University Extension Service. And that's another thing that you can see linked to from the website on this card. So I originally found it a few years ago. Then my absolute hands down favorite book on native pollinators is the second reference there, the Xerces Society Guide Attracting Native Pollinators. And amazing coincidence, I'd had that book on my shelf for years. I've been ordering from Northwest Meadowscapes for years, and I finally connected that Eric Mader, I believe is his name, is the chief author of the book and who runs Northwest Meadowscapes. So I was pretty delighted when I found that out. Although I haven't yet admitted it to him because I do email with them quite a bit. Then the rest of the sources, there are a few more Oregon State references there. There's a pretty sweet short book, the fourth one there, that the National Wildlife Federation put out called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. It's a great intro book. The book put out by Eric Mader is pretty dense, but it's also a really wonderful reference if there's specific pollinator. It talks about both the plants, and it has guides for both the plants and the pollinators. So if there's like a particular bee or butterfly that you want to learn more about, and their book is really focused on bees because bees are the main workhorses in terms of the pollinators, in terms of what the amount of pollination they're actually going to provide for your garden. So it's a great, like if there's a specific bee that I want to look up, that's the book that I go to figure out what is it attracted to, what are its, what are host plants, etc. And then the final resource there is more of a hybrid between native design with a little bit of pollinator information, but so if that kind of hybrid piques your interest, Real Gardens Grow Natives. That's a book out of Seattle, which is another sweet book. So thank you all for listening about pollinators, and I can't wait for Thor's talk next month to learn more about them.
Oh, it's incredibly power-packed. And she will make sure that we have all of those handouts and references as we send out the link to the recording that we've just done. Now is the time for questions. Do you want to run back here? 1, 2. Hi, Gary.
Can you talk a little bit about the lawns again and irrigation considerings especially? Are some of those lawns going to do well without regular irrigation?
I try my darndest to convince every client to not irrigate lawns. I do a lot of work with Huck Phillips, who's amazing, and he staunchly will not irrigate a lawn. So that's our approach. The main trick is how to establish the lawn, because that obviously needs supplemental water. And we the biggest thing that you can do is seed that lawn at the right time. And it is, the tricky part about it is, especially if you read the bag of lawn seed, it's going to say that you want your temperatures to be higher than they probably are actually going to be here when it's actually raining. So if you wait for it to be warm enough, you're going to miss the rain. And so we tend to seed a little, or we really prioritize moisture over temperature, making sure that so for the fall, we're going to wait until it starts raining to do any of our seeding on any projects. And then we're also prepared wherever possible to add supplemental water and old school overhead sprinklers, just because we're only trying to use a minimal amount of water as possible. But if you can get your lawn or native meadow grass established in that first year or two, probably means some supplemental water in the summer, depending on where you are. That moisture is really key. But then if you can get past, especially with the Florida lawn example, even in the second year, we've hardly watered it at all. Just the clients are part-time residents on Lopez. They throw their overhead sprinkler on it. If their like grandkids were coming up and we're going to be running through it just to kind of lush it up a little bit, make it a little softer. But I think only a handful of times use supplemental water on that. So timing is really key. And yeah, we try for the most part to avoid any sprinkler systems if we can.
And with the Florida lawn, do you mow it at all, or what's the sort of maintenance?
Either way, I would definitely encourage you to mow it at least twice a year, just to keep any weeds at bay. Some on one site where we have it, the pictures of, we just let it go totally wild all year, and I think it looks just awesome. There was one year where that family had a lot more visitors, and so we did mow it for a month or two, but nowhere near as short as you would a normal lawn, just so it was easier to walk on. But you can really go either way with it. You can let it be a little longer, closer to a foot tall and more wild. You can also mow it pretty regularly. We would never go any lower than 4 inches, probably closer to 5 or 6. But it is great to always mow it at least twice a year to keep weeds at bay. Scott, do you have any thoughts on that? No, you're dealing with taller grass and grass that needs to serve nutrients.
Yeah, but even if you're mowing a lawn, you know what you see most people mowing. Most of the lawns that you see mowed are way too short. They rob the soil of nutrients. They expose the root systems. And if you doubled the height of it, you'd have more grass with less effort and much nicer lawn. So we have one of those zero turn running lawnmowers, and it's always set at the very highest setting. And then when you do get moisture again, they come back much quicker. You know, the key is organic matter in the ground, and if you mow it down really short, you just expose that and burn it all up. So, yeah.
If you don't know Scott, he runs Sweetgrass Farm. He's an expert.
Sure.
What would be a source for the Douglas aster? If you wanted to plant it, where would you get it?
Last year, I sourced it primarily from local native plant sales. The Salal chapter of the Washington Native Plant Society is in Mount Vernon at the WSU extension right along the highway there. They had probably only 2 dozen, and I bought most of them. Is he? Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, great. I've been bugging him to do that. Is it great? Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so Sunset, fantastic. And then Salal, typically they have people grow it for their sale. And then the plant sale through the San Juan County Land Bank typically has some as well.
Thank you.
The Florida,
Florida lawn.
is how fire resistant is that? Because
That's a really good question, and I don't have a concrete answer to it, but I would say that because it's low growing and it has a lot of the leaves of the species that are in that mix are not, they're not going to get as brittle and dry. It tends to stay a lot lusher looking and softer and et cetera, and retain more moisture. So I would say, without having done any studies on it, that on the spectrum of things you could seed a lawn with it, I would imagine it to be much more on fire resistant into the spectrum.
And how would you establish what would you do on the ground to prepare for seeding with fleur de lawn?
Depending on how your soil is, most places on Lopez, we end up bringing in several inches of compost. And if we have the budget to do it, working it into the soil. If we don't have the budget to do it, just laying it on the top of the soil and seeding into that. And then something that really helps the success of germination, especially if you have a lot of birds around, is putting down even just like an 1/8 inch of topsoil over that to hold the seed down. And then rolling is another thing with a weighted roller can help press the seed down as well, especially if you do have some new fluffy soil.
If you're working to replace other grass, do you take it out completely or kill it, or?
Ideally, you would sheet mulch it before, like the year or 2 beforehand. Do a long-term sheet mulch, ideally for at least a year, to kill it off, and then go forward with seeding the new lawn alternative. Sheet mulch would be putting down layers of cardboard or even heavy-duty landscape fabric and letting it essentially bake with solar to heat up and kill off the grass roots. But it does take time, but it's the most effective thing to do, I've found. I mean, you can also scrape off your existing sod, but then you're losing a bunch of good soil and nutrients that otherwise you hold on to.
Dominating the questions. In the stems for pollinator habitat, do you have any particular plant recommendations that are really excellent stems?
A really obvious one, and from that first slide with the awesome flower petals in it, sunflowers are great because they're such a big woody stalk. So I always try to leave sunflowers up for the winter. And because they're tall, they tend to be, I always tend to tuck them into corners of gardens anyway. So I find that they're kind of visually unobtrusive that way. Just cut off the flower head and let the stalks sit there by, I mean, I typically have them by some kind of garden post so I can tie off the heads so that they don't flop over into the garden anyway. So that's a great one that I find to be really easy to get into the garden. In terms of perennials, I mean, all the echinaceas, rudbeckias, they all have pretty darn sturdy stems as well. So those are ones that I leave up as well.
Can you give us some of the background information around your philosophy not to irrigate?
Sure. The main thought is that we're on an island with limited water resources, and lawn is just about the last thing that I would say, with my own ethics, needs to be watered when we need it and our plants need it and our animals need it. So that's really the main point. And luckily there is a big movement across the nation. I mean, in California, you can't water your lawns anyway. So I'm hoping we get there in terms of regulations someday. I think it's really important. But I think we're in a specific place here that with scarce enough resources that, I mean, they're, especially out on the Fisherman Bay Peninsula, there's no water there. So obviously we're not going to irrigate any lawns out there. But I think, before that, affects more areas, we can be mindful and try to get out in front of it. And actually was pretty happy when the Fish Bay Water District lowered their monthly consumption, because it essentially cut out irrigation. And so I'm really encouraging everyone to go to water catchment for their irrigation, because I think it's holding us more responsibility, and it's still way cheaper water than most places in the country. So we're pretty lucky in that regard. But I think it's just a way to take responsibility, living in a water scarce area and looking at how the climate's changing.
You mentioned the tufted hair grass. When you plant that, does it stay one clump, or does that, once you have it, spread it all over the garden like all your other grass?
It does not self-seed. It stays as a singular clump. It's a very well behaved grass.
Oh, good. And does it need open space, or can it grow under fir trees, for instance?
It likes full sun, so it would be a challenge to have it under fir trees. But it is a smaller grass, and so you can plant it quite densely together. You can space them 12, 18 inches apart. So it doesn't need a whole lot of space, but it definitely needs full sun.
Thank you. I'm taking that one a step further. What would you plant in an area that's shaded by fir trees?
That's a great question. Do a lot of that. If you have a lot of space, Something that's working really well as an understory plant for me is the Pacific wax myrtle. I buy a lot of that from Stephen. And it has a very inconspicuous flower, but I bet it still does something in terms of pollination. It's not on any of these lists, but it does have a flower, so I bet it serves some purposes to pollinators. What else? I mean, and ferns, which don't do much for pollinators. One thing I'm trying right now, what flower is it? I've got some lily of the valley that is was attached to a fern that I transplanted and then now is under some furs and seems to be doing quite well. So again, it's not on the pollinator list that I have, but it's something that so far is doing pretty well. But that's definitely under furs is a tricky place. So if you remember the slide where I was talking about leaving bare space for the bee nest, that's most often what I do, is the under the furs is a great space to leave some space, as long as it gets just a little bit of sun, because it does need to the ground does need to warm up for their nest. But I like the photo that showed the I'll just scan back to it, but we've left space under the fir trees. And those spaces were getting full sun. So here on the right, under those fir trees, there's some patches of bare ground there that I'm sure with all the flowers that are coming up there, my hope is that lots of bees are moving in there. So it kind of takes a little bit of a retraining your mind. It reminds me of Dixie's quote. What was your quote from the last newsletter? If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. I love that. Let's very much just a paradigm shift of it's okay to leave some open space and find new beauty in it and what's hiding underground. But it's something that I have definitely that it's been a professional challenge for me in garden design and planting plants to not fill up every square inch of space with plants. And leaving bare ground with no mulch, no landscape fabric, and mud puddles, and it's a real learning curve in more pristine looking gardens, but I'm trying to do it everywhere. And it takes some convincing with clients in particular, but I think the more we can do it, the more successful it'll be overall.
You have to maintain your bare space, like that grow there.
Well, under fir trees, nothing will. That's a good spot. And also I've noticed right now we have, I think, several nests along a fence line where nothing's growing. And kind of on the edges of driveways where you're outside of the gravel realm, but you can kind of find some dry spots around your property, hopefully, that it's kind of naturally occurring, and rather than fighting it, leave it. And same thing, like I mentioned, finding a bunch of vole holes yesterday, and there was definitely a nest in one of them, rather than always filling all the vole holes in your field in, like maybe just leave some of them for the pollinators, especially those were very close to some apple trees. So I encourage my client to not fill them in and let the bees have those holes. Because they will, that is something they'll do. They'll find holes dug by larger creatures, or excavators, so to speak, compared to the bees, and take them over.
Do you have any other favorite grasses you could recommend?
Oh, I have so many favorite grasses. I don't know a lot about, I'm working on a list of pollinator matches for grasses. But grasses that I plant a lot of here on Lopez that do really well. If you're not afraid of things spreading, Mexican feathergrass is pretty awesome and fun, and it looks really beautiful with perennial pollinator flowers. That's a real favorite. My favorite tall grass, which you'll see at the Family Resource Center and Housing Lopez and a lot of projects, is Carl Forrester feather reed grass. And it grows about, human height, But the main cluster of greens are like waist height, and then it has this tall inflorescence that comes up, and it's very well behaved, but it grows. It's a nice sizable plant without being a pampas grass. So that's my favorite large grass, and it's just beautiful. And even in winter storms, once it's established, it holds up pretty darn well. Occasionally you have to stake it, but often if it really does start, if the inflorescence starts blowing over, at that point in time, I'll cut just the tips off of it. But it'll typically hold its form all the way. The challenge is more of it'll hold its form all winter, and you have to remember to cut it back to the ground before it puts on the new growth, or to about a foot or so. But that's a great tall grass option.
There's nothing on the chat right now. No?
So I have lots of things that my husband just constantly wants to clean up. And so I need to be able to tell him we cannot cut that down until when? Because if I can tell him, no, those are really essential habitat, he's going to want to know how long does he have to leave that not neat thing?
So two different approaches. One is, like I mentioned, leave instead of deadheading all the way to the ground, leave the stalks 6 inches, 12 inches, maybe start with 6 inches one year and see if you can get up to 12 the next year, and etc. Each pollinator emerges at a different time, and a different time in the spring. And if not, the ones with shorter lifespans are emerging all the time. So unfortunately, there isn't a safe bet to say, unless you go plant by plant and pollinator by pollinator, to know exactly when you can cut things back. But one general rule of thumb that some gardeners use is after our first day at 55 degrees. A significant number of at least the bee species will emerge once we're fully into 55 degrees. So that you could use that if you're looking for something really precise, which might need to work in your case. That would be one suggestion, to go with your first 55-degree day. But then maybe also start working on 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches.
You make me feel so much better about my garden. Truly.
The bees love you.
It's looking better every day, gosh. Thank you.
Thank you.